In the year 2025, the total population in American prisons and jails ranges from 1.8 million to 2.2 million. With a total American population of 340 million, 1 in every 176 Americans is behind bars, the highest rate of locking up its own citizens of any country in the world. But the story does not end here. The American government has only managed to lock up a little over 2 million people, not because it does not want to lock up more, but because it simply lacks the capacity to do so. In recent years, civil society groups such as the American Civil Liberties Union and the Prison Transparency Project have published many reports, and only then did Tuanzhou learn that the 2 million plus prison population is only the portion actually stuffed into cells. Outside the American prison systems, large numbers who ought to be locked up have not been. As of March 2025, besides the 2 million already locked up, another 670,000 Americans are on parole, and 2.9 million more on probation. Add the three together, and the total number of Americans awaiting or already serving sentences reaches a staggering 5.5 million. In other words, 1 in every 65 Americans has been through or is about to go through a sudden awakening behind bars. Count the ones not yet caught, and America is essentially a nation of prisoners and prospective prisoners. Walk 5 minutes down any ordinary American street, and the chance of not meeting a prisoner or ex-prisoner is near zero. Faced with this absurd and staggering scene, many of you might say that Americans are evil by nature, and if they do not commit some offense every morning, their whole body feels out of sorts. So getting arrested serves them right. This conclusion is convenient, but it lets slip a far more hellish truth. The American people are in fact the biggest victims because large-scale high-ratio imprisonment is not only an institutional arrangement deliberately designed by the American ruling bloc, it has already become a basic condition for American society to keep functioning at all. Hello everyone, I am the new content creator Tuanzhou, and today let us look at why must Americans go to prison. To argue whether this mass incarceration is deliberate and systematic, you need to establish three things. First, the reasons behind it. Second, the process of execution. And third, the underlying motive. As for the reasons for imprisonment, that alone is already quite hellish. To be fair, so many Americans being behind bars or about to land, there is not really because they have committed monstrous crimes. In America, there is a special term for this: the mass criminalization of minor offenses. In plain language, it means making trouble out of nothing, or criminalizing every trivial thing. As everyone knows, American federal laws are as numerous as the hairs on an ox. As of 2024, the full text of the Code of Federal Regulations exceeds 180,000 pages, updated constantly, with thousands of new laws or amendments added every single year. Provisions overlap, are deliberately vague, and crisscross one another, forming what is essentially a giant pile of spaghetti code. This gives police and prosecutors enormous discretion to carry out selective enforcement based on whatever public opinion happens to be hot at the moment, and the electoral needs of their superiors. Whenever needed, even jaywalking, sitting on a sidewalk for no reason, being homeless, or simply loitering in affluent neighborhoods can all be swept into the category of a misdemeanor at any moment, leading directly to arrest and prosecution. By American statistics, misdemeanor charges nationwide reach an astonishing 13 million every year, not even including civil infractions, such as speeding. That means roughly 13 million Americans each year are thrown into the criminal justice process over these petty, trivial, and often fabricated matters, fall into the pot of the American legal system, and the squeezing that follows is truly terrifying. That is because in American judicial practice, those charged with misdemeanors simply cannot get any meaningful legal aid whatsoever. What about? If you cannot afford a lawyer, one will be appointed. Come on. American public defenders are reserved exclusively for serious and high-profile criminal offenders. What would a respectable, law-abiding citizen like you ever need a lawyer for? Who are you guarding against? Americans? For what purpose? On whose instructions? Are you here to smear the country on the orders of external forces? With no free legal service available whatsoever, you have no choice but to hire a lawyer yourself. In America today, let alone the American poor, even the American middle class finds that hiring a lawyer is a surefire ticket back to poverty. Annual legal spending in American society has reached a staggering $380 billion. The median hourly rate for a criminal defense attorney has exceeded $750, while 40% of American households cannot scrape together even $1,000 in emergency savings. So forget a drawn-out process with lawyers. Even consulting a firm for just 1 hour will burn a serious hole in your seat. Yet without a professional criminal defense attorney by your side, let alone presenting any evidence, you might not even manage to pass the bail stage. Guilty or not, a single small mistake could earn you a prison experience card lasting several months to half a year. As of this March, the various American states were already holding 450,000 Americans who had not been convicted of anything at all. They are locked up simply because the American federal judges are far too busy to find the time to try them. Even if you manage to secure the pretrial release that everyone in an American legal drama enjoys, it all comes down to how fat your wallet really is. The median felony bail in America has climbed to $10,000 US, equal to 8 months of income, which most people dare not attempt, while misdemeanor bail ranges from a few hundred to a few $1,000s, far beyond what most poor people can afford. Given all of this, the answer is painfully obvious. To avoid drawn-out pretrial detention and to escape the litigation costs they simply cannot afford, poor Americans are left with only one option: plead guilty as fast as possible, dutifully handing the prosecutor a nice KPI in exchange for probation, so they can stay out of prison and keep their job. But on probation, it is very easy to violate the terms without even realizing it. Right now in American prisons, 1 in 5 incarcerated inmates, about 19%, is locked back up for violating probation. Once an innocent person is forced to plead guilty, they end up with a criminal record, which makes finding any work an uphill battle, and means the next time anything at all happens, you are branded a recidivist and face extremely heavy sentencing. Many states also have 3 strikes rules on the books, meaning that after 3 convictions you can be sentenced to life imprisonment. After this smooth little combo, misdemeanor offenders already account for 25% of the total incarcerated population in America. And in some more severe states, the figure is even higher, to say nothing of those forced to plead guilty, stuck on probation, and living in constant fear of the next violation. This alone proves that the imprisonment the United States federal government has imposed on its people is not only enormous in scale, but in its rationale carries a heavy character of deliberateness and entrapment. Imprisonment is not free, of course. America currently has 1,566 state prisons, 98 federal prisons, 3,116 local jails, 1,277 juvenile correctional centers, 133 immigration detention facilities, and 80 Indian tribal jails. Spending reaches $182 billion a year, 20% higher than Russian military spending the prior year, and more than double that of Germany, Saudi Arabia, and India. Spending that much to lock up idle mouths, does it not ache the heart? Rest assured, capitalism feeds absolutely no idlers, and doing time means you must work. This brings us to the second question: the process. In 2024, several American civil society organizations asked the federal government and all 50 state governments for prisoner forced labor numbers. Under American law, this is public records, disclosure, entirely reasonable and lawful. Guess what happened? Only the federal government and 8 states provided data. Some said they lacked the data, others could not be bothered to count, and the full 27 states simply ignored the request entirely. Of course, they were not eager to hand over these figures. In fact, in the course of mass incarceration, out of the 2 million American prisoners, 791,000 are forcibly put to work by the American prison systems, serving as incarcerated laborers, and the single most important labor resource for American governments at every level. In Florida, 3,500 slave laborers serve several hundred state and municipal governments and dozens of state colleges. North Carolina used thousands of slave laborers to build roads. New York and Oregon are more polite about it, sending them to call centers as telephone customer service agents. Arizona used 1,083 slave laborers on public works, with work hours in the 2020 fiscal year reaching a staggering 1.8 million. The foremost capital, Washington, D.C., relies on 1,000 incarcerated laborers to clean its waterways, land, and public parks. Mississippi went even further and made it a standing rule that every single state prison must provide labor to its local government completely free of charge. In every natural disaster, though you will never see the US military show up, the sandbagging, rubble clearing, and reconstruction work all depend on incarcerated laborers. California has long relied on incarcerated firefighters, who risk their very lives battling the state's devastating wildfires. For the sake of international optics, American prisons do pay incarcerated laborers a tiny wage, But the level of compensation is far too generous to be believed. The more generous states of Hawaii, Maryland, and Illinois, at the very top end of their pay scale, offer a whopping $1 to $2.75 per HR. The slave labor of firefighters, risking their very lives on California forest, fires earn only a single $1 an hour. The less humane states of Idaho and Louisiana pay a maximum of just 2 cents to 9 cents an hour. Just when you think it could not possibly get any lower, there are the utterly inhumane states of Alabama and Georgia, as well as Florida, whose economy has been booming. And what do they pay? Exactly zero. What is more absurd is that this is still not the end. Even with such a tiny wage, slave laborers never actually get it, because wages are paid to the American prison systems, not to them. As soon as the authorities receive the money, they fleece the flock, like plucking feathers from a passing goose. In the first half of 2021, of wages earned by federal prison workers, 59% was deducted for maintenance, room, and board. The federal government at least has some shame, deducting only 60%. In Minnesota, where they have thrown all shame to the wind, they deduct 77%, meaning roughly 80% goes to others, rather than the American workers. At this point, you might think after deducting 60 to 80%, the remaining 20% of scraps must surely go to the American prisoners, right? Think again. The bosses have far more tricks up their sleeves than you can imagine. In 2024, a civil society organization reported a truly heartbreaking story. In a cold winter, an American mother shut off her electricity because her son was in prison, and the exorbitant telephone charges meant she could not afford her electric bill. Cutting power at least let her speak with her son in the dark. The prison telephone industry now reaches $1.2 billion a year. In Connecticut, a single prison telephone service call costs 32.5 cents per minute, of which the American state takes a 68% cut. GTL, Globaltel Link, monopolizing 85% of New York in prison telephone service, charges $9.56 for a mere 15-minute call. To afford just 1 minute of telephone time in a New York State prison, prisoners must labor for 8 to 10 long hours. If a virtually cost-free telephone call already costs this much, then the basic necessities of prison life, such as soap, toothbrushes, warm clothing, and towels, all cost 5 times or even 10 times the hourly wage of the American prisoners. So although prisoners nominally draw a pitifully small wage, in reality they are nothing but slaves, because they cannot possibly cover the basic cost of life in prison. They must hold out their hands to their families, paying out of pocket just to sit in a cell, which worsens prisoner household conditions dramatically and leaves fully half of them forced into crushing debt. For a long time, many people assumed private prisons are the ones that force prisoners to work. That seriously underestimates the absurdity of the American prison system. At present, all private prison companies combined operate only 8% of American prisons, an absolute minority. So the main actor forcing prisoners to work is none other than the United States federal government itself. Under this squeeze, American prison slave laborers produce at least $2 billion in goods a year, provide $9 billion in prison maintenance services, and supply American governments with critically important unpaid slave labor, taking on urgent, difficult, and dangerous tasks through forced in-prison consumption. They also hand private prison companies and telephone companies abnormally huge profits, and by being forced to keep committing crimes, they continuously supply the American prison system with fresh blood. Viewed from the angle of mass incarceration execution, although prison spending is enormous, it has successfully bound ever-growing interest groups together, which secures lobbying and policy support, keeping the entire system running smoothly for the long term. What is more serious is that prison forced labor today is mostly repetitive work maintaining facilities, while genuine skills training jobs are exceedingly rare. As a result, when most prisoners are finally released, they have no money, carry a prior conviction, and possess no skill to make a living, while their families have been bled dry by expenses racked up during their time in prison. To survive, the moment they walk out of the cage, they are very likely to turn to crime again and may well drag their families in with them. As a result, at least a quarter of all those who have been to prison will be rearrested and locked up again within the very same year they are released. In the end, they either become career criminals or form part of the permanent prison population that never leaves the system. And so we reach the final question, the motive. Why does the American ruling bloc impose mass incarceration and forced labor on its own people? In truth, just take a look at history. and everything becomes crystal clear. Looking at the long historical view, mass incarceration in America has not always existed. Even during the immigrant crime wave of the 1860s, the United States federal government did not pull this particular stunt. However, in the early 1970s, a new doctrine arose in America, neo-punitivism. It advocated replacing rehabilitation with punishment, demanding harsh sentencing, fewer probations, the complete abolition of parole, and long-term incarceration. This doctrine arose quite conveniently, coinciding with the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, after which the American prison population began climbing rapidly and relentlessly. When President Reagan took office and pushed neoliberalism in 1981, the American prison population shot up like a rocket and kept climbing for 30 full years. And when did it finally come down? Right after the 2008 financial crisis, when American society began to reflect on over-financialization and deindustrialization after 2009 and 2010. In other words, every single time the United States federal government ramped up mass incarceration, it lined up almost perfectly with American deindustrialization and the consolidation of rule by the ruling financial monopoly bourgeoisie. Looking across countries, the deterioration of crime trends in the capitalist world during the 1960s was not uniquely American at all. From 1960 to 1990, violent crime in the United States, Germany, and Finland all grew 2 to 3-fold. But in incarceration, America tripled, Germany held steady, and Finland actually dropped 60%. In the end, only America, which turned toward financial monopoly bourgeoisie rule and aggressively pursued deindustrialization, resorted to harsh laws and severe punishment as the answer. At this point, the answer is ready. The reason enormous numbers of ordinary Americans are locked away in prison and saddled with criminal records, the reason they are forced into cells to carry out dangerous and grueling slave labor, is nothing less than a campaign of preventive repression by the American financial monopoly bourgeoisie. When profit-seeking pushed development to deindustrialization and financial exploitation, when they realized this would strip ordinary Americans of upward mobility and cut off the chance to obtain jobs and share in economic development, and when they preached neoliberalism and stripped away most social welfare, they faced an American people likely to revolt. In response, the American ruling bloc, with the Reagan administration as its typical representative, deployed a soft hand and a hard hand. The soft hand was to use the US dollar and the US military to exploit the world, and after reaping profits, use the leftover crumbs to ease class conflict and buy off the upper echelons of labor unions and the labor aristocracy. The hard hand was to launch mass incarceration while pouring enormous sums into federal courts and police for repression, dividing the American poor into two groups, one arresting people and the other being arrested. This repression manifests as the failed American war on drugs, the ever-worsening police brutality, the unstoppable smash-and-grab looting, and the endless racial conflict, and also as the enormous incarcerated population and the omnipresent slave labor of prisoners. All you can say is that for the past few decades, the time when the American gentry feasted on meat, while the masses sipped broth, has lasted far too long. Most problems in that society have been papered over by exploitation alone. Today, because of the rise of the socialist powerhouse and the deep-rooted, unsolvable problems of the United States itself, harvesting leaks overseas has become much harder, and social contradictions have surfaced dramatically. After ordinary Americans sensed the shaking of American hegemony, they also began seeking the deep-seated problems buried within their own society. Like the grassroots group at the start of this video, the Prison Transparency Project, though it has only a handful of people, still works tirelessly to dig out the causes behind American prison slave labor. After uncovering the truth, they have taken the case to an international body such as the International Labor Organization, as self-rescue by the bottom of American society. This is a welcome and encouraging step. If the American people truly awaken, 2025 will probably be an unremarkable but deeply memorable year. However, the weapon of criticism can never take the place of criticism by weapons, and in the end, it will be entirely up to the American people to bring this history of brutal oppression to a close. That is all for today. Do not forget to subscribe.